Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to MSDynamicsRole.com's Spring 2015 Financial Automation webcast series. I'm Jason Gumpert, and I'm joined today by a returning speaker for us, someone who many of you may already know, and that is Jody Christensen of Microsoft. She is back with us today, and she is a program manager for Dynamics GP. We're really excited to have her joining us again, this time to talk about Dynamics GP's still quite new workflow capabilities. And before we get started, I'd like to also just briefly recognize our Financial Automation Series sponsors and thank them for their support of MSDynamicsWorld.com. They are Perceptive Software, Metafile, DocStar, Bottom Line Technologies, and Avalara. So moving forward, we do invite you to add your feedback and ask Jody questions today. She'll be taking time to answer questions at the end of the session, but you can enter yours anytime throughout. You can use the Q&A block that you should see to the right of the slides, and we will take as many as we have time for at the end. So without further delay, I am happy to welcome Jody Christensen. Jody.
Thanks, Jason, and hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the workflow capabilities inside of Dynamics GP. And as Jason said, I'm a program manager here at Microsoft. I've been with Microsoft almost 16 years working with the Dynamics GP product. So let's get started. So I first bring up this slide just to talk about what we envision as a workflow inside of Microsoft Dynamics GP and what we're considering an actual workflow. So with the workflow, this is just a simple example of how we would position this. So a warehouse supervisor can enter a requisition in the system, and this can be any transaction. It doesn't have to be the requisition if you're not planning on using that type of functionality. So it can be any transaction. But the transaction is entered, and then the first step is the requisition clerk, she'll enter the vendor. So they have someone that's her duty is to enter the vendor for any requisitions that users enter. And then there's basically the two steps in between there. So Phyllis will approve it if the requisition is greater than $5,000. And if it's greater than $25,000, then it also has to go through Sarah as the director to approve. So once all that is done, then the actual requisition would be marked as complete. Now, it doesn't have to go through all of these steps. The one on the left with the selecting of the vendor, that would, of course, be required. But if it's less than $5,000, it technically wouldn't have to be approved by Phyllis. So it can go through a different path depending on how it was entered. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about workflow and what kind of things that we can do, the business process information. And we automate that, of course, now through Dynamics GP. So let's talk about that and how this works. We did have a prior version of workflow that used SharePoint. We did have a dependency on that. We did get a lot of feedback that it was difficult to set up and use and customize many different things. So we did remove that SharePoint dependency with this version of workflow. We also have it available in the web client. So with the web client for Microsoft Dynamics GP, you are able to use all of the workflow functionality and the desktop client or on the web client itself. So no matter which version of GP you're using, you can use this new version of workflow. We also improved the design itself of the workflow, being that it's inside of Dynamics GP. We have the ability to go through and use the GP windows that you're familiar with in setting up the workflow and in assigning the users and that type of thing. So we've made it a lot easier to set up workflows. You can copy them. So there's increased flexibility around that as well, depending on how you want to go through and do an approval process or different things like that. We do have the ability to go in and customize those workflows for you and for your business. So the design and the feedback that we have received so far since we released this version of workflow has been much improved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and talk about setting up the workflow. I've just got a few more slides, and then I'll actually go into GP itself and just walk you through the different information inside of GP rather than showing you through the slides. Again, if you have questions, we can certainly take those in the Q&A panel, but I'll probably answer most of that towards the end, and we'll have plenty of time for the questions at the end, so that should be okay. Just one more thing with the workflow maintenance. When we're setting up our workflows, we have different workflow types, which I'll go through here in just a few minutes. And you can set up as many of those workflow types as you need to, but only one of them can be active at a time. So if we're talking about like the requisitions, you can set up a workflow requisition to go through your business process of approving those requisitions. If for some reason you want to change to a new one, you can set up a new one and then make that new one active when you're ready to activate it. So there is the workflow type itself, which I'll have a slide here of what the workflow types are available, and then the actual workflows themselves, and then we have multiple steps. So that's the one-to-many for our steps. You can have as many steps in that workflow process as you need to get your workflow approved and go through that process that you have. So the different workflow types that we have available, workflow itself was released, or this version of workflow was released in GP 2013 R2, so last year, and we had 4 of them available. We had purchase order approval, the purchase requisition approval, and then for payroll we have time cards, and project accounting we had timesheets. So in GP 2013 R2 we had those 4 workflow types available. And then in 2015 we added quite a few more. So we have the batch approvals for general ledger, receivables, and payables. And then we also added our vendor approval for payable for in the purchasing side. And then in payroll, we rounded out some of the former business portal functionality we have now in workflow with the employee profile, employee skills, direct deposit, and W-4. Business portal does not ship with GP 2015, so any of the business portal functionality that we had there would now be taken in with workflow. And then to alleviate the business portal, we also created the expense report approval inside of Dynamics GP. So in Business Portal, where we had the requisition management, the payroll information, and then project time and expense, all of those now have been created inside of GP in our workflows. So we do not ship Business Portal for 2015. So the workflow capabilities that you see here, this is what we're using instead of that. But the workflow that we have has been very well received. We are adding even more for R2, so stay tuned for some of the things that are coming out with R2 as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go into Dynamics GP and go through and we'll set up a workflow and talk about how everything works inside of Dynamics GP. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I'm in Dynamics GP, and this is 2015, the RTM version. So what I'm going to go through is just show you how we do our setup of our workflow, and then we'll start entering some transactions, and you'll see how things are flowing through. So the first thing that I want to do is actually go through and go to my workflow maintenance window and show you how that's going to be set up. So that's under our administration page, and I'm going to scroll down under company. Then we have a new option for workflow. And I'm going to go into our workflow maintenance window. This is where we see the different workflow types that are available. So we have the 4 under purchasing that you'll see here on the screen. And if I do my drop down, financial and sales, they just have the batch approvals. Payroll does have those 5 that I mentioned on that slide. So the profile, the skills, direct deposit, time card, and W-4. And then for project accounting, again, we have our timesheet and our expense reports. So those are the different areas that we have. We just separated them into the different series that we're, most of us are familiar with inside of GP. So the first thing I'm going to do is when you're looking at the workflow maintenance window, the workflow types that we have are over on the left-hand side in our tree view. I'm going to go ahead and set up a vendor approval since I don't have that one set up yet, and we can walk through this process together. So the first thing that we see over on the right-hand side is the manager. Now the manager of a workflow, they're the ones that can come in and modify the steps that you have. They can set up the steps for the workflow. If they need to come in and adjust something, as a manager of that workflow, they have the ability to go in and view what's going on with that workflow. They don't have access to everything, but they do have access to the actual workflow type that you're setting them up for. So I'm going to go ahead and just assign myself. Right now this is actually using Active Directory, so this is my Microsoft information that's coming across here. So I'm going to add my information here. There is another place that this window is used, and I will explain that window when we get to that step process here in just a few minutes. So you can assign more than one manager in this window. That's certainly fine. If you want to have more than one, you would just add another person in that window that came up. So once we have our manager assigned, I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to click on New Workflow. And this is the workflow that I'm going to set up for my vendors. So maybe when I have a vendor that I'm going through and setting up in my system, maybe I need to have someone call the Better Business Bureau on that vendor to make sure there's nothing against them. And then maybe they need to do, check the credit limit or something like that. So we can set something up like that. So I'll just set up, whoops, this is called vendor approval. So that's the name of my workflow that I want it to go through. And then we can set up multiple steps. So that's where the step, condition, and assignment are going to come in here. We can set up multiple steps for this actual workflow. So I'll save that. And then our step option is going to be available up here. I'll explain the rest of the options and the tasks here in just a few minutes as well. But let's look at our steps first. So in our step maintenance window, again, we can have as many steps as we need to, but maybe we need to call the Better Business Bureau. And this isn't really an approval step, but it's more of a task. So we actually have two different step types that we can set up on the workflow. So the approval would be, if you're approving in a timesheet or if you're approving a requisition, those kind of steps. The task step is more like you're doing something. So you're, putting a vendor on the requisition, or I'm going to call the Better Business Bureau. I'm not really approving anything at this point. I'm just making sure this task is done on this step, and then I'm going to basically complete it. So you're not technically doing an approval. We call that a task step. So I'm going to set this one up as a task. Since it's my first step in this workflow, it's going to automatically default to this step is a first step. And then depending on how you want to set this step up, is this action hours required? Or maybe it's only required when there's certain conditions that are met. I'm going to click on the radio button for certain conditions just so I can show you what this condition editor window will do for you. So if I click on the blue expansion arrow, this is going to bring up my workflow condition editor window. And this is where you can set conditions. Maybe you only need to call the Better Business Bureau for certain classes of vendors or something like that. So what you could do is, or maybe it's certain cities, you can come down and pick one of the fields that we have on here. Maybe I'll just do mine for state. So if the state, if they're in Illinois, then I'm going to call the Better Business Bureau, and then I click OK. So when the vendor master state is Illinois, then I need to do this task. Otherwise, I wouldn't need to do it. So you can put conditions on these steps, so you can decide how you want this step to go through in the actual workflow. So you can add more than one step. That's certainly, or more than one condition in that window. You can certainly do that. If I go back over to this window, I can add something else. I can display an extended list, so that gives me even more fields. If I want to find different fields in here, I can do that as well. So there's a lot of different conditions that we can add inside of that condition editor. But that's something that you can go in and then decide how you want to do that. For now, I'm just going to leave this as always required, just so I can go through and do the approvals. Once we have our steps completed, or our conditions completed, then we go down and we do the assignment. So under the assignment, this is where you assign the step to someone. So if I do the lookup, this is that same window that came up when I assigned myself as the manager. So my selection type, I've got 3 different options in here. So I have people and groups, hierarchy, and workflow role. So when I come in and do the people and groups, that's the Active Directory. So it does use Active Directory to go through and look up the information as far as who can do the approvals or who can you assign. So when I do people and groups, that's where I went and looked up myself. I know my alias, so I can go ahead and add that in. So that's one way that we can do that. You can also do a group. So if you want to assign that to, maybe you have a few accounts payable people, you can assign it to that group of people. That would work as well. The other options in here are hierarchy. So if you start with hierarchy, you have Workflow Originator, the Workflow Manager, which is the one that I set up when I first came into the window. And then you can also do what we have, or what we call an alternate final approver. And I'll explain that here in just a few minutes. So what this really does is, if you start with the workflow originator, so if I'm entering the vendor, I would be the workflow originator. And then if you want to assign it to my manager, you can say direct manager. So whoever your manager is, they would be the ones that would go through and do the approval. You could also do skip level or number of levels. So if you want to send it to, 3 levels above you, then you can put in the level of 3, and that would go to the third person above you in Active Directory and assign it to that person. So that's how you can use the hierarchy. And then there's also the workflow role. So you can assign it to the workflow manager, the originator, or the alternate final approver, which is another approver that we can set up inside of workflow. So depending on how you want to do the approval, that's where we would go in and see this information. And again, just for ease, I'm just going to add myself to this as the approver for this step. So I'm going to add that and click OK. And again, you can do more than one. If you do more than one, then you have the completion policy that would be available. So you can do only one response is needed, the majority must take action, or all users must take action. So if you assign 3 people, do they all need to approve, or maybe 2/3 of them? So you can decide how you want to do that as well. There is a time limit that you can set for the approvals. You can do it hours, days, and weeks. So there is a calendar that you can set up, and I'll show you that here in just a little bit. But the time limit allows you to set certain limits for when users get that email notification that they've been assigned this task. How long do you want before the system can do something about that if they're not doing the approval or not completing that task? So by default, it sets it to 8 hours, but you could do, 2 days, you can do a week, however you want to do it. And then there is an escalation policy, and I'll show you that here in just a few minutes as to what happens if they don't complete it in that time limit. Okay, so the next thing is the send message. So there are some automatic messages that will go out to the users when they're assigned to do an approval or a task step inside of workflow. So there's some default messages, and I'll just go ahead and bring this one up. So it's using my Exchange because I have the Active Directory information in here. So it'll just bring up my window. There we go. Okay, so this is the message setup window. And what this allows you to do is, by default, these are the fields that are going to show up on the email when the assignment notification comes through. You can edit this information, so you can have different fields print on or show up on the actual email or the body of the email if you want. By default, it's going to give you some information as far as the document type, the vendor, the ID, the class, payment terms. There's different information depending on which type of document it is. So if it's a timesheet, it gives you the hours and those types of things. So some of them are different. They're not all the same. But you can add different information if you wanted to add, the vendor address on here for some reason, or maybe you want the vendor's phone number on here on the email that goes to the approver. You can add different fields on here if you wanted to do that. That's what this information is showing you. For line item information, like for requisitions or for purchase orders, you can do document lines as well. So if you want to print the item and the quantity and extended cost, that type of information, you can have that show up as well. And that would be done in the document lines. We really don't have that on a vendor approval, so not a lot of information on that one, but it does allow you to add that. And then there's also workflow fields that you could add as well. So if you wanted to put in the originator comments, actually those print by default, so that's okay. But the workflow originator, the person who actually submitted this, the status, the step name. So if you have multiple steps in here, the step name would actually be printed as well, which is the step that you're doing here. So you could have different fields print on here depending on what information you want to show up on that message. And then you also have a reply sent to option. And this can be useful if you're, sending this, and if someone hits reply all, where do you want that email to go to? Do you want it to come back to the originator? Do you want it to come back to a certain department? For the vendor setup information, maybe you want it to come back to the purchasing department and not one specific person. So you could have the reply sent somewhere else other than the person who is sending the email. So that's just another option in the messages. So there is a default message ID for every single one of our default workflows that we have, the workflow types. So all of the messages can be edited and modified if they need to be. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that. So that's my message option. So once I have this information done, I'm going to save my step. And I'll do one more new step. So maybe I have another person that needs to add the credit terms. And we'll call this one an approval. And that's always going to be required again. And again, I'm going to just assign this to myself just for ease. And again, we can send that same message. Okay, so now that I have the second step, you'll see over here on the right-hand side where it says order, I could say this is the second step, the step follows that first one that I set up. Or if I want them to happen simultaneously, I can also say this is a first step. So it doesn't matter which one they do first, then they would both go out at the same time, and the people that are assigned to do the approval, they could do them in any order. It wouldn't matter. If I leave it the way it is right now, first thing that it would do is, the person would have to go in and complete the task for calling the Better Business Bureau. And then the second thing would be go in and do these credit terms and doing the approval. So the first one would have to be done before the second one. So if I save it like that, it's going to look like this. If I say that it's both a first step, then it just rearranges it so they're both in the same order, or they're in the same columns. So then it doesn't matter which one is which, and you can have them both be completed at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. And again, you can have as many steps as you need to when you're going through and setting up your workflow. But the one thing that we need to do, once we have our steps all set up, then we come back to the vendor approval, the actual step information, so we can see all of our steps in here. So I have my Better Business Bureau, my credit terms. And then just to explain the rest of this window, we'll go through and do that first here. So we have different options that we can set up for each of these workflows that we're setting up. So the first one is to send notifications for completed actions. So if you want more than just that default assignment notification, those will go out, if you click the send message in the steps like we did. But if you want other messages to go out, maybe the workflow originator wants to know when it's been final approved, so you can mark this and have it send the carbon copy to the workflow originator and click OK. So then the workflow originator, maybe it's a requisition for, a new computer. They can see, or they'll get an email saying, okay, this has been final approved, and maybe you'll get your computer soon, that type of thing. So there's other email notifications that can go out. So if you want to say when the task is complete, send that back to the workflow originator, or copy your direct managers on something like that. So there are other default email notifications that can go out if you want them to, and that's what that window would be for. The second option would be allow approver to delegate tasks. So we have approvers set up to go through and do an approval, but do you want them to be able to delegate it or give the approval or the task completion to someone else? So in my case, I have the calling of the Better Business Bureau assigned to me. Well, could I delegate that to a coworker? And that's what this option is for. You'll get a delegate option inside the approving windows that we have, which we'll go through. And that just allows someone else to do the approval instead of you. Can the originator be an approver? So if I enter a requisition or I enter a PO, can I approve my own information? And maybe you can up to a certain dollar limit, that would be allowed. So that's something that you can set up in these conditions if you wanted to do something like that. But if you want to be able to enter and approve something yourself, then you have to have allow originator to be approved. And then we also have the always require at least one approver, and then use alternate final approver. One of the things that typically works, let me just go back to my screen or my slides here for just a minute, and I'll show you this one. It kind of works better on the slides. So the way that this works, if Ken submits our purchase order, and they have two steps. If it's country Canada, Phyllis approves, and if it's country USA, then Sarah can approve. Well, what can happen, if there's, depending on how complicated your steps are, things can fall through the cracks. So if a purchase order was entered, for Mexico, it doesn't qualify for either one of the two steps that we see here, Canada or the U.S. So what happens to it? Well, if you want someone to approve that, then you would want to have that option to always require at least one approver, because that way then someone will get the approval for this requisition or purchase order that's been entered. And then what happens is the final approver, the alternate final approver can do that approval process. So you can set up an alternate final approver. You have the manager that can go through and set up a lot of things, but there's also an alternate final approver. So if it doesn't meet some of those conditions, someone else will still be able to go in and approve that, in this case, purchase order or whatever the transaction may be. So they have the ability to go in and do that. So it allows us to go through and catch things that may fall through the cracks when we go through and set up our different steps. If you didn't think of absolutely everything, it'll catch things if you say, always require at least one approver, and then here you can say use an alternate final approver, and then we get that same window where we can assign, a person, a direct manager, that type of information. So that's where we can set up that information. Okay, and then the last thing in this window is when a task is overdue. So I mentioned in the actual steps, I'm going to go back there for just a second. In our assignment, we have this time limit, and then we have a calendar that we can go by. So what happens then if the person that's assigned to do the approval, if they don't take any action in that certain amount of time, there's different options that we have. We can have the system take no action, so it won't do anything. We can escalate it to the next approver. So in our case, would it go on to the next approver, depending on what it is. If we go back to my original example, which I believe I've set up here. So in our case, I had my requisition was entered. If it's greater than 5,000, it goes to one person. If it's greater than 25,000, it goes to another. So if the person that's assigned to this step, if they don't go through and do that approval, if you have it set to escalate to the next approver, it would go to this next one that's doing the $25,000 approval. So you can have it do that if you want to do next approver. You can escalate it to a certain person, maybe the top person in the department, or the top person in your company. If it's small enough, they could be the final person that you escalate it to in this case. Otherwise, you can automatically reject the overdue task, and then it would send it back to the originator. So they would at least know that it didn't get approved. It goes back to the originator, and they can re-enter it if they want to, or resubmit it, I should say, and start the process over again, depending on how they want to do that. But those are the four options that we have when the task is overdue. Okay, so now that I have my vendor approval option set up here, the last thing I have to do is mark it active. If I don't mark it active, then I'm not going to get the workflow information in my vendor maintenance window or my transaction entry windows. So let's go ahead and mark it active, and I'm going to save it. Oops, I'm just going to take no action there. That's fine. Okay, so now I have my vendor approval is marked as active. And if I go over to my purchasing area page, and I go into my vendor maintenance, we get our workflow information up here at the top. So I'm going to set up a new vendor. I'll just call it ABC Company. So as soon as I entered my vendor and ID and tabbed off of it, you see that now I have the workflow information up at the top I can submit. And then this is what we call our workflow info bar. So it knows which workflow is active. So it's my vendor approval, and my status right now is not submitted because I haven't submitted anything. So I can go through and enter my information for my company. And I'll just assign it to a class just so I don't have to enter quite so much information. Okay, so I have my information entered. Now I can go ahead and hit submit. And when I do hit submit, I do get this workflow action window. So this is where you can enter a comment. Whatever it is that you need to put in for the comment, and then I can click submit. So at this point, it's going to go to the first approver, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. So it's automatically going off to the approver. If I bring up that same vendor in this vendor maintenance window, it'll say pending task completion, and I assigned it to myself, so it's assigned to me, and it tells me when it's due, so it gives me the date and time that it's due. You'll also see this navigation buttons on the right-hand side. Because I set it up as the 2 first steps, I can go to the next one, and this one's also pending approval. So I have both of those conditions set up, and or both of those steps, I should say, and they're both pending approval at the same time, because that's the way I set it up. If you wanted to do one and then the next, we can certainly do that as well. But that's where it's pending the approval for the information here. So that's just the basic entering of the information for my vendor. I'm going to go ahead and just close this. All right, we have other options that we can do. If I do purchase requisitions, I can go through and enter a requisition as well. Maybe I need that new computer. I'm not going to go through every single transaction that we have for workflow, but I just wanted to show you one more. Requisitions, again, this was available back in GP 2013 R2. And what it's doing, or what I'm doing, just entering my simple transaction here. I don't need to enter everything that's required. That can get entered later, but I can also submit that. I won't enter a comment, I'll just hit submit. But I wanted to show you one more thing. Whoops. When we're looking at this. So if I entered my requisition, so for this one it says my vendor selection, that's the step that is pending, and that's actually waiting on Jen to do that. But we also have a view history option in here. So if I view history, it gives me everything that's happened with this requisition so far. So you can see that I originated it. It's less than the $5,000, so this greater than 5K step, it's actually already approved. The system does that automatically because it's not greater than 5,000. So the only step that's pending is my vendor selection, and Jen needs to come in and do that. So we don't have to do anything else for this one. So it does look at those conditions, and if the condition is already met, it'll automatically approve it, and we can see that in the workflow history. Okay, so I mentioned with the entering of the transactions, we get some different notifications through email. So let me bring up my email here. And here's the one that I just entered. So this is the default information that prints. So you have a task assignment for the vendor, and it's an ABC company because that's what I entered. And it tells me I've been assigned a task and the workflow for ABC company. It gives me the deadline. It gives me the drill back information, so edit or view the record. So if I click on that, it'll pop open inside of GP. So here's my vendor record. So if I wanted to drill back into it and I'm a user of GP, I do have the ability to do that. Get my message, here we go. All right, then we also have these 3 options in here, approve, reject, or delegate. And this can be very useful if you have approvers that are not inside of GP, they're not GP users typically. They can take a look at this email, get the information that they need, and then they can do the approve, reject, or delegate right from this email as well. So what happens with this is it's using web services. So you do need to have web services installed in order to get the approve, reject, and delegate to work. But what this does then, if I hit approve, it comes out, brings me into a web page. Here's my document of ABC company. If I wanted to put in some kind of comment, I can do that. Otherwise, I can just click approve, and then it says it's been submitted for this step. What happens then is it's going to go through and do that approval for that step. We still have one more that we need to do, and we'll get back to that. But I could also do reject and delegate. I can't do that now because I've already approved it, but it does allow me to do the do that approval right from my email if I have that capability. This is where you can customize this email and put in the information that you want to see. So we have our document type of our vendor approval, and then all of the other information. This is the comment that I entered. If there's more information that the approver would want to see before they actually approve it, that's how you can modify and adjust what comes through on this email, but that's where you see that information as well. So that's one way that we can do the approval, is through the email notifications that we're getting. Okay, so back in GP, the other ways that we can do the approval, if I go back into my vendor maintenance window, again, as long as you're a user of the system, you can see that that task was completed. If I go into my view history, that task was completed the Better Business Bureau because that's when I approved out in that web page. The other thing that I can do now, since I'm a workflow approver as well, I can do the approval right from that vendor maintenance window, or if it's a transaction, you can do this from the transaction entry window as well. So I can mark task complete. And now if I bring up my information, it says that my task is completed. Now I would be able to go through and use this vendor throughout the system. So the workflow process has actually been completed for this vendor. Everything is set up and ready to go for this vendor. So you can do the approvals right from the entry window where you submitted the workflow as well. The third place that we have to go through and do the approvals is actually from a navigation list as well. I'll show you that here in the requisitions. We have the option for requisitions not submitted, and then we also have them for pending approval. So I have one that I haven't submitted. I have one that's pending approval. And you could submit right from the navigation list if you want to as well. The submit would be available. The one nice thing with this navigation list, if you have multiple requisitions that you're assigned, you can come in here, look at the information, see who's assigned in here, and you can go ahead and approve and complete right from here. These aren't assigned to me, so I'm not going to be able to do that, but you can do multiple approvals in this window as well. So you can mark all of them and go ahead and hit the approve. You could also copy this one to a new requisition and start a new one right from this navigation list as well. If it is completed, we also have the purchase option. So once your requisition is completed and through the workflow process, then the next thing is to purchase it and turn it into a PO, and then you can do that right from the navigation list too. So there's lots of different ways that we can go through and actually do the approval, those three different methods. Okay. One other thing I just wanted to mention quickly as well, we're talking about the transactions. In GP 2015, we did, and 2013 R2 as well, we did come out with some new homepage parts. So if you're using the time management from payroll, the requisitions from purchase requisitions, or project time and expense, we do have new parts that users can use. So if they're only entering a timesheet, if they're only entering, their time cards or looking at their time off, that type of thing, they do have these parts right on their homepage. There's a self-service role that people can be added to, and so they would get these three options on the homepage if they're using all three. But then they can get directly into what they need to do. So if they need to enter a timesheet in project accounting, they just click on the link and they go right into that window. Same thing with the requisitions. If they need to enter one, they can click on it. If they have any time card saved, they can enter it right from here and get right into their time card that they need to enter. So just some quick links into the different options that we have for those users that they're just coming in to do what we call the self-service roles, but they're all related into the workflow capabilities that we have. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to my administration page because there's a few more things I want to show you as far as the setup itself. Okay, so when we're talking about the emailing capabilities and that type of thing, there is some setup that we need to do with workflow. So under System, there's a Workflow Setup option, and this is where we come in and we say what our SMTP server is that we're using, what kind of authentication do we want to use, and then down at the bottom is the email actions. And this is where you would put in your GP Web Services server and what that port is. So this is where we would come in and actually test or set up that information. You can do a test email. So if you want to send yourself an email to make sure they're going through, you can do that. You can also do the test email action to see if Web Services is connecting correctly as well. So that's where we would come in and set up that type of workflow information for the emailing capabilities. You don't have to use the emailing if you don't want to do the approvals. You don't want those email notifications, you certainly don't have to, but this is where you can set up that information to do that. Okay. The other options that we have, if I go down under Company and I expand my workflow again, this is the calendar. This is going back to those time limits and how long people have to do the actual approvals. So you can set your normal workday information, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, or whatever it is for your company. And then these are the non-work days, of course, so then they wouldn't be counted if you have so many days. The weekends wouldn't be counted, and then these specific days as well. So that's how it will do the counting for that information. And then we also have out-of-office delegation. So if an approver is going to be gone, for an extended period of time, and they want to go through and delegate who can do their approvals for them, that's under User Preferences. So if I go to User Preferences, there is a workflow delegation, and we can delegate the tasks for me. That's who I'm logged in as. And then what happens then is you can do this for all workflow types or by workflow type. So, okay, so for all workflow types, I can delegate to a certain person. Now let's do Jared. Oops. Okay, so I could delegate it to Jared, give it a start and end date, and then any of my assignment notifications would go to Jared instead of me during that time. So you could do that for all of the workflow types, or you could do it by workflow type. So you would, select which specific workflow type you want to delegate, and then do the same thing as go ahead and assign the different information to that delegate. So a manager that is, the workflow managers, they could come in and do this assignment notification for someone in that workflow as well. So if they happen to, fall ill and they aren't in the office to come in and do this themselves, the manager of that workflow type could come in and do this on their behalf as well. So there is a way to come in here if you're not actually set up to view that information. Okay. Okay. So one more thing that I just wanted to show you in this email setup window, I'm going to go ahead and look at my PO approval, because I did actually go in and edit this one. I added these document line fields, and what that means, so if I'm entering a purchase order, I also want the item number, description, the quantity ordered, and the extended cost to print. And maybe I want, well, let's put the line number in there too. So I can add that information into my message ID itself. And then when I come back over to my body, I just had to go through and say document line fields, and then I clicked insert, and then it inserted it right here for me. So that's how I can add the different line item information for my purchase order. So let's save this information. And then I'll go back over to the purchasing side and enter my PO. Okay, so let's get a monitor for my new computer. Okay, so I've entered my line item information. We'll just do one more. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and submit that. I don't need a comment on that one, but I'll just click submit on my workflow action window. Okay, so what that's going to do then is going to go out and send that email to me, and it'll put those extra lines on there for me. So again, if I'm an approver that's not inside of Dynamics GP, I have the ability to go in and see that information in my email notification that I get. So here's my PO step, 2079. Okay, that one didn't work apparently. All right. Okay, I'm not going to go back and look at the other ones. I had one earlier that I could go back and show you, but it would print the line item information out for you as far as the item number, the item description, quantity, and cost. It does go through and print that for me. I must have missed something when I went through and did that setup, but let me go back out to my slides here, make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, the only other thing that I wanted was there is no specific GP user licensing for workflow itself. the licensing is based on the actual process that you're doing. And I mention this because of the employee self-service information that we have, transactions that we have, like payroll, entering a timesheet or, editing your payroll information, entering your project time and expenses, and then entering requisitions. You can use the self-service license to enter and approve those. But if you're entering a vendor approval, going through and doing that, if you're in any of those types of windows where you would need a full GP user license, you would still need a full GP user license to do that and submit it through approval. So if it's the employee self-service information, you can use the self-service user type. But for the other things, you would need a full service or a full user inside of GP for that. So with that, why don't we go ahead and we'll take some questions, Jason?
Okay. We've got several that have already come in, Jody, and we can maybe start near the top here. So does the payroll workflow work with Canadian payroll?
No, it does not work with Canadian payroll. It's just U.S. payroll right now.
Can I use extender window fields to set my conditions?
I haven't tested that, but I did get the question before, and I believe you can. I just haven't had a chance to actually test that for sure, but I've been told that, yes, we should be able to.
Okay. If I have a document attached to a vendor, can I add this document to the email sent to the approver?
That's actually a feature that we're adding for 2015 R2. So the ability to email the document attachments with those workflow notifications, that's something that's coming in R2.
Great. How would we prevent transactions to unapproved vendors?
When it's going through the actual approval process, I think this is what you mean, but when you set up a vendor, and as long as it's in the workflow process, either not submitted or the status that we call it is pending user action, so there's something that needs to be done for it, it acts like the vendor is on hold. So you can't post any of the transactions. I believe you can enter and save them, but you can't post any transactions. You can't do any payments, those types of things with that vendor until it has gone through the approval process.
Can you determine the requisition number from the purchase order transaction or inquiry windows?
It's not in the inquiry windows. No, you could create a smart list and get it that way, though.
All right, great. I want to just remind folks they can enter their questions in the Q&A block that is on the right of the slides. What does it mean that only one workflow type can be active at any time?
Okay, let me go back out and share my screen again, and I'll try and explain that a little better. Okay, so when we're in the workflow maintenance window, so I've got a payables batch approval workflow set up called PM batch. Now I could go through and set up a new workflow, PM batch 2, but if I try to mark this as active, oh, okay, let me do one step here. Okay. Okay, so I have just another simple approval set up. So my PM batch 2, if I try to mark it as active, why do I not? Okay, it tells me that you already have an active workflow of this type. Activating this workflow will deactivate the other one. Do you want to continue with that? So what this is really saying is I could set up more than one, but I can only have one active workflow at a time. So right now I'm using PM batch. Well, maybe I want to change my workflow process. Maybe I don't want it to go through path A, I want it to go through path B, which is, a different workflow functionality or different workflow process that you want to implement. So what you can do is go through and set up the new workflow process. So that, PM batch 2, you could set up different conditions, different steps, that type of thing. And then when you're ready to do the switchover, then you can make that second one active, which will deactivate the first one. If you have any batches that are out there, they would still go through that old process. the old workflow process that you had set up, but it allows you to go in and set up more than one as kind of a failover. You can't have two active at the same time because it wouldn't know which path to go down. So that's why you can only have one active at at one time. But it allows you to set up a new one if you want to change your process and go down a different workflow path is really what that's for. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, we have a few SharePoint questions. I'm going to try to sort of condense them together here.
Okay.
So with regard to licensing, can you talk about whether any licensing requirements are going to be separate, as well as compatibility questions, SharePoint 2010 or 2013, and compatibility of either of those with GP 2013 R2. Let me see if there's anything else here. And environment for running SharePoint. Does it have to be the same environment as GP?
Okay, I'm not sure why they're asking about SharePoint because we don't do any dependency on SharePoint anymore whatsoever. So I'm not sure if these questions are just because you're asking, but we don't have anything with workflow and SharePoint anymore. If you're talking about the old workflows, on GP 2013, you could still use the old workflow types that we didn't move over. So the four that I mentioned, purchasing, requisitions, the POs, the time cards, and the time sheets, those four are the new workflow, but the other ones, you could still use the old SharePoint functionality, but with 2015, there is no other SharePoint functionality there. So I don't know any specific versions because we're not supporting it.
Okay, a couple of folks have asked if there is a download available for your presentation today.
For the slides?
I assume so, yeah.
I assume that's what they're looking for?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. If you want my slides, I'll leave my email information up there. If you can just send me an email, I can certainly send it out to you.
All right, great. Are there any plans to add a means to import requisitions into GP via eConnect or another tool?
We don't have any set plans for that, no. Not that I'm aware of, no. So just entering inside of GP would be the only way right now.
Is there a way to set up workflow in a test company and then easily move that workflow into your production company?
Yes, you can copy workflows. So when you're setting up the workflow, if you set it up in a test company, you'd be able to copy it over to the new company. Yep.
Okay, a couple of folks have asked about licensing for email approvers and just, I think, licensing in general. So one question is, do you need a user license for email approvers? The user has no need to access GP as all the details are in the email.
Right. So if they're just using email to approve, no, they don't need a GP user license at all. Because if they have no reason to go into GP, then you would not need a GP user license, no.
And can you discuss web services for being used for users who approve in an email?
Yeah, so the web services piece, that's web services comes with GP. It's just on the DVD download that you can install it, and it's just a fairly simple installation that you would go through, and it just connects your company information and makes the web services available. Because really what it is it's talking to your GP information out in SQL is really what web services is doing. So there's not a special license that's needed for that, though.
Is there any role for the self-service license regarding that point?
There is a user role. Let me clarify this here. I'll show you.
While you're bringing that up, I just want to note we are recording today's session. If a couple of folks have asked about that too, we'll be making that available and sending you an update on that.
Okay, so these ESS roles, so you can assign users to the employee self-service role for payroll, project time and expense, and then purchase requisitions. When you assign those roles, It gives the users access to enter a requisition. They can enter the time, expenses, and payroll, that type of thing. It also gives them these homepage parts if they want to use the homepage information and, once they log into GP, use these to navigate around. So giving them the roles does give you that information. It doesn't give them access to anything else. They can enter their information that they need to for the employee self-service stuff and then go on. If they're an approver, they could go in and approve as well. But that's where that's at.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, another question is asking about the role of, so can employees enter project time in GP 2013, I assume just GP 2013, instead of using Business Portal?
In 2013 R2, they can do the time, it's just the expenses aren't there yet.
R2,
so,
okay.
Yeah, 2013 R2, it's just timesheets that were available. They have to go to 2015 to get time and expenses.
Are any workflow reports available without having to click on the individual workflow history?
We don't have any out-of-the-box reports, no. You could create a smart list. That's probably going to be the easiest, unless, SQL reporting services or something like that. But we don't have any out-of-the-box, no.
All right. Does Microsoft have plans for a push to mobile for approvals?
Not right now.
All right. Can you inactivate a process that has steps pending?
You can. It does give you a warning message that there are existing workflows out there, and if you inactivate it, they're still available, to go through and finish the process. It's just going to finish that old process, not the new one if you're switching to a new one.
All right. We only have a couple more questions here, so I'll make a last call. If anyone else has one, please do enter your questions into the Q&A block now. If I have one user and one approver for each office, and I have 3 offices, how would I create a vendor workflow in that way?
Okay, I'm guessing the user enters it and the office person approves it, if that's what you're meaning. You can assign the approval based on, well, there has to be some way to distinguish the different setting up. So there could be a field, that you put on the vendor maintenance window as far as who's, which office is entering it, or if it's based on an account number, there is a way that you can do it based on account numbers as well. So it depends on how the actual vendor is setting it up. If you want to send me an email, we can chat offline about that, or I can give you some more tips if that would help.
Okay, and I guess we'll wrap up here with a couple sort of user type questions here. Is there a discussion for a requisition only user license, or is still a full user required to enter a requisition?
Well, it's called a self-service user. It's 2015 R2. We are coming out with a self-service user type. So we'll have full, we'll have limited, and then we'll have the self-service user type, and that can be used for people entering requisitions, and that's much lower price point than the limited. That's actually been available since 2015 was released, but we'll actually be able to choose it as a type when R2 is released. So, but that's for the employee self-service, so payroll, project time and expense, and then requisition. So it'll cover all 3.
Okay, and I apologize if this question may be covered, but can limited users submit PRs?
I assume that means purchase requisitions. Yes, they would be able to right now.
Great. Thanks for sticking it out through all those questions. I think we are at the end of our queue. We're right at the top of the hour, too, so great timing. Jody, let me just say thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us and take all these questions today.
Thank you very much.
All right. We are recording today's session. We'll be making it available online soon and send everyone an update. With that, we will conclude the event. Please look for the quick survey that should pop up as you leave today. We really appreciate the feedback. Our speakers do as well. That concludes the event. Thanks and have a great day.